Morning, everyone. My name is Jeff LeGros. I'm a professor here at the University of Virginia, and I'm also the Vice Provost for Global Affairs. And in that role, I cannot tell you how delighted I am to see you all here at the University of Virginia today, because we truly have the globe represented here, and we hope you enjoy your time. It is true that I was a Fulbrighter, so I've been out in conference rooms like this in different parts of the world, just as you're here today. And even before I was a Fulbrighter, I did an exchange within our country as a graduate student at Georgetown University, where I worked with then Professor Alan Goodman, who's now the president of the Institute for International Education. So a special welcome to you here, Alan. Good to see you. I have the pleasure this morning to introduce our plenary speaker, and that is my distinguished colleague, Professor Philip Zelikow, who is the White Burkett Miller Professor of History at the University of Virginia, has also served as the Dean of the Graduate School here, and has also served as Director of the Miller Center. Professor Zelikow came to the Academy from a career diplomat position. He served in overseas and in Washington on the NSC staff in the White House of President George H.W. Bush. In 2003, 2004, he directed the 9/11 Commission, producing a report that people actually read and had a large impact on how government ran after that. He also served as counselor of the Department of State as a deputy to Secretary Rice. And he continues to serve, or has served, as a member of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, as well as on the advisory board for global development of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And he remains a consultant to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He will speak for 10 to 15 minutes this morning, and then we will open up the session for questions. So please be thinking of your most difficult questions, because Professor Zelikow loves difficult questions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Philip Zelikow.
It's a great privilege to be here today, surrounded by so many leaders. I will start by telling you a kind of fairy tale. In America, we always begin our fairy tales with the words, "Once upon a time." Once upon a time, there was a country in Europe that used to be called Czechoslovakia. And for many years, this country was ruled by very powerful rulers. They called themselves socialist or communist, and they were very strong. Also in that country, which was called Czechoslovakia, it doesn't exist anymore, there was a playwright. He just wrote plays. And the plays that he wrote were sad, they were funny, they were truthful. So naturally, the government of his country put him in jail. In 1989, the government of this country was overthrown by the people in what they called a velvet revolution. And of all the people that they chose to make their new president, why, it was this playwright, whose name was Václav Havel. So Václav Havel, that playwright, now the president of Czechoslovakia, stood up before his people on the first day of January 1990. And in the speech he gave to his people, he opened it as follows. "My dear fellow citizens, for 40 years, you have heard from my predecessors on this day different variations on the same theme, how our country was flourishing, how many million tons of steel we produced, how happy we all were, how we trusted our government, and what bright perspectives were unfolding in front of us. I assume you did not propose me for this office so that I too would lie to you. He then added that there were actually many problems in Czechoslovakia, but he concluded, he said, the worst thing is that we live in a contaminated moral environment. We fell morally ill because we became used to saying something different from what we thought. Inspired by that fairy tale, I are only two messages that I want to leave to you today in a very short set of remarks. And I'll be lucky if you remember even two, 15 minutes after I'm done. The first message is that you leaders happen to be living at the dawn of a whole new era in global history. And that's something. And the second message is that at this new dawn, you will face some very old enemies, which I will describe. So first, the new dawn. I do teach history here at the university. I teach a class, actually, in modern world history. And in this class, I talk about how the Industrial Revolution and the globalization of the 19th century, especially in the late 1800s, transformed the whole world. All of your countries were touched by it. And because of that, there was a global struggle as to how to organize these new modern industrial societies. That global struggle, political, cultural, often violent, ran from about the 1890s until the 1990s. Virtually every political party, even their names, almost all of your major institutions were created between 1890 and 1950 in response to this struggle. As that struggle ended in 1990s, there were these great blocks of powers. We sometimes referred to the Cold War and other kinds of blocks. And those blocks dissolved. That was an era dominated by international conflict and global rivalry. Now, history did not end in the 1990s. In a way, it had a new beginning, a new dawn. A couple of singular features of that new dawn is that for the first time, the dominant issues of world history today are transnational rather than international. The great dividing lines are not between different blocks of states. The great dividing lines run across states. Think of what the great issues are that will probably determine the future of world history. How we handle issues of energy and environment. How we handle the rise of ultra-hazardous technologies, from the cyber to the biological. How we handle issues of transnational public order, whether in Brussels or in southern Mexico. How we handle the future of global capitalism. How we address the fate of the bottom billion of humanity in 50 states that are failing and whose populations are being left behind. You'll note, in no case can those problems be defined neatly by rival blocks of states. These are problems common to almost every country in the world. They are transnational, not international. Notice, too, that none of these problems can be solved by any one nation alone. Notice also a second aspect of this new era of world history. When I grew up and I trained to be a Cold Warrior, there was foreign policy over here and there was domestic policy over here. And some people studied foreign policy, and some people studied domestic policy. In your age, the difference between domestic and foreign policy is rapidly disappearing. Indeed, all the great foreign policy issues actually present themselves in your countries as domestic issues. The issues of security, energy, environment, the control of hazardous technologies, all of these things are usually in the provinces of your domestic ministries, often the work of state and local authorities, not just the national authorities. The old institutions we had, the old dividing lines we had, the old parties we have, they actually don't know how to talk about this new era yet because we're still in its first generations. And that new era is combined with another economic revolution on a scale comparable to the Industrial Revolution that transformed our world 100 years ago, and that is the digital revolution. I believe the digital revolution is actually in its early stages, roughly comparable to where the second industrial revolution was in the 1870s and 1880s. And that we're on the verge of transformative changes for which none of our institutions or political dialogues are ready. So we're at the dawn of a new era. And you notice the key is transnational common work across national boundaries using the powers of our nation states together. But the second point I promised to talk to you about was that you would be facing old enemies. America does not face today, and most of your countries do not face today, a hostile, evil bloc of states comparable to what I grew up with in the Cold War. When I think about the states that America worries about, for instance, I might think about Iran or Russia or China. But if you think about what do those states have in common, they are not united by what they are for. They are only united by what they are against. They are the anti-liberals, and they share that fiercely in common. Most of you are in politics. You all know that in politics, hate is usually stronger than love. It's a sad truth. I tell you this, and you know it. You know that it is much easier to unite people by what they are against than to unite them on what should be done about it. These countries, and many people in many countries, including my country, are united by what they are against. They are against liberalism. And liberalism, I don't mean in the usual way Americans use that term. I mean it in the way people understood it, even in Jefferson's time, as people who are devoted to the idea of liberty. The tenets of classical liberalism were always about freedom of thought opposing dogma, openness to merit opposing hereditary rule and entrenched aristocracies, the liberty of individuals as opposed to the tyranny of too strong governments, the openness of business opportunity opposed to the monopolies which were usually in collusion with the governments. These were the principles that Thomas Jefferson understood, but also the principles that Václav Havel perfectly well understood. They are the principles that are opposed by the governments that rule today in places like Iran and Russia and China on every one of the points that I have mentioned. That's their touchstone. And what's their argument? Their argument is that this liberalism has no values. It has no spiritual quality. It is decadent. It is materialistic. Putin makes exactly these points, as does his entire ruling elite. Homosexuality, libertinism. If you read about what they hate, The ideologues in Tehran sound just like the ideologues in Moscow and the ideologues in Beijing. Fortunately, there are liberals in China and in all these other countries, and you may judge for yourself what kind of prospects they may have. And actually, China, I think, of the three, is the most interesting case right now, because I think even the Chinese themselves do not know what their future will bring. But this point is profoundly important for all of you. The old enemies you face will be the anti-liberals. And this was true in the 19th century. The 1860s were the zenith of liberalism and liberal ideals. Slavery had been brought down in the United States of America. The Pope had been defeated on the Italian peninsula. Constitutions defining and restraining the role of government were all the rage. Even the Ottoman Empire adopted a constitution in the early 1870s. Everyone felt they needed it to have it, at least with the homage that vice always pays to virtue. And then came the anti-liberals, the people who tried to unite others by their hatreds, the people who tried to turn the liberal ideal of the nation state into the anti-liberal ideal of the nation race, who extolled the virtues of militarism and the spiritual ideals of triumph, of new kinds of hierarchies of masters and slaves. If this program and why you are here stand for anything, it is that you stand for the liberal ideals that are only recourse against these old enemies if we want to meet the challenges that will dominate the 21st century. And as you think about inspirations, I don't call on you so much to think of Americans. You can read about the Americans and judge them for yourself. I call on you actually to think of people in your own countries. I call on you to think of people like the Japanese thinker Fukuzawa Yukichi, one of the great liberal thinkers of all time. Fukuzawa Yukichi, maybe you haven't heard as much about him. He was a poor-born samurai in Japan, born in the 1830s. He came to the United States with very little money as part of the first Japanese diplomatic mission to the United States in 1859 and 1860. Speaking no English, he acquired a copy of this new book that Americans just published, which they called a Webster's Dictionary. And using this dictionary, he taught himself English. He came back to Japan and wrote a series of books, including a book in 1875 called A Theory of Civilization, in which he explained from a Japanese perspective what civilization should mean. He went on to become one of the founders of modern Japan, the founder of Keio University in Japan, and the alumni of Keio pay homage to Fukuzawa Yukichi every year on his birthday. And his ideal was that national independence would only come from personal independence, and personal independence could only come from understanding the liberal ideals that stood for civilization, that stood for the open and civilized world he hoped to build in Japan and he thought was the basis for true independence. So when you think of inspirational ideals, you can think of Fukuzawa, or you can think about that playwright in the fairy tale. When Havel was released from prison and told that he was going to be put forward as the president, a journalist came to Václav Havel and said, Mr. Havel, what have you learned from your experiences? Havel thought about it for a moment. He says, well, I've learned this. When a person tries to act in accordance with his conscience, when he tries to speak the truth, when he tries to behave like a citizen, even in conditions where citizenship is degraded, it won't necessarily lead anywhere, but it might. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we have this mic on? Thank you very much, Professor Zelikow. That was an incredibly interesting set of remarks. I'd like to open the floor for questions. If anyone would have questions, just raise your hand. We have people with microphones that are circulating, I believe. And I will start off the questions myself, which is I was intrigued by the discussion of the transformation to a transnational world, where domestic politics and international politics are interwoven, and the notion that we don't have the institutions to deal with that change. So what would those institutions look like? What is the via media to this new world? Are they something more akin to the European Union? Are they something more akin to ASEAN? What are the institutional innovations that we need to work on?
Well, let me give you a couple of examples. Just give me a very concrete example. Americans read a lot, for instance, about wars in the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan. They may not know that more people have been killed by violence in Mexico than have been killed by violence in Iraq over the last few years. Probably more people killed in Mexico than Iraq and Afghanistan put together. The problems in Mexico are transnational. Anyone who knows anything about them knows that the United States is intimately involved in Mexico's problems, in their causes and solutions, as are the countries of Central America. The same would be true if I went all through Central America or down to a place like Colombia. Then if you were to talk to people in Mexico, you say, what are the solutions? It's not the foreign ministry, mainly in Mexico, that's the solutions. These transnational problems are being addressed by honest police, a court system that can work, restoring trust in government and making it more meaningful. So then we ask ourselves, what kind of institutions do we need? We need two kinds. We need institutions that train people to solve problems. And frankly, I don't think our colleges and universities, even in America, do enough to train people to solve public problems. But second, we need institutions that recognize that almost all of our problems have to be solved through indirect action. That is, if Americans are concerned about something happening in Brazil, the Americans can't go down to Brazil and fix it. The Brazilians will have to fix it. So if the Americans want to have any influence over what the Brazilians do, that has to be a means of indirect influence. And by the way, if the Brazilians want the Americans to do different things, then the Brazilians have to figure out how to indirectly influence the Americans. So actually, programs like this are a very interesting example of transnational institution building. The discussions you will have over the next 2 days about how we can solve problems in common and create a common vocabulary is a start. But frankly, my government has institutions that were built up primarily to win and wage the Cold War. Most of my government institutions in its national security state were created in its modern form between 1940 and 1960. And our institutions are hugely out of date, especially the ones that deal with international affairs. Most of the problems that confront us don't really come to the doorstep of the State Department, but the State Department is called upon to talk about them anyway. And therefore, more and more of it gets bumped up to your chancelleries and to the tops of your governments because no one knows where those problems lie. So it's those two kinds of institutions that we need. The first are institutions that do more to train people to solve today's public problems or even to teach them about those problems. And second, institutions that have more of a transnational focus and overcome the old domestic-foreign divides that marked us when we built those institutions.
Thank you. Questions? Questions? Have one in back, please. Others?
Hi, I'm Les Jacobs. I'm a Fulbright Research Chair at the Wilson Center from Canada. It was a very interesting discussion there. And I have a comment about the institutions, or really a question about institutions. One of the sort of high points of what you're characterizing as the transition to transnational history was the establishment of the World Trade Organization. Arguably, it personified exactly what you were trying to suggest would happen as an institutional solution. But arguably, what we've really seen in the last 20 years is that begin to fall apart. So I do work on international economic law, and what we've really seen is a shift back to bilateral or multi-trade agreements, even at that are things like TPP rather than a World Trade Organization. And I'm just wondering how that fits into your theory about the new history that stage in history that we're embarking.
Trade is a perfect example of how the conversation hasn't caught up with modern realities. The World Trade Organization was created in part because more and more corporations were becoming global, and you needed actually global rules that went beyond the old tariff barrier formulation. But let me put it to you, I would argue that even words like trade, imports, and exports are actually already obsolete, and we don't even teach our children about it. So I have in my hand here a thing called an iPhone. So question, is this iPhone an import or an export of the United States of America? I'll tell you, and technically it's called an import because it was finally assembled in Shenzhen, China. Now actually, even though it was designed in Cupertino, California, now actually if you study this, only 3% of the value of this iPhone was actually added in Shenzhen, China. By the way, the other 97% isn't from America. This defies any notion of import or export. Take out the, you take this iPhone, for example. The Gorilla Glass that encloses the iPhone is designed by an American firm called Corning that is based in upstate New York, but its fabrication facilities are in Kentucky, Taiwan, and elsewhere in East Asia. Most of the components of the iPhone were actually created by companies in Japan, Singapore, Germany, France. It is brought together in a bewildering variety of ways that simply defy any of these old categorizations altogether. Is this iPhone a good or is it a service? Well, of course, it's both. You take out the software and it's nothing but a polished brick. Software is characterized as a service, but we treat it in our laws as if it were a good. And then how is the software created? Is that created only in the United States? I mean, you think about this for 60 seconds, and these terms simply fall to pieces. We could give example after example of the obsolescence of this way of thinking about the modern economy. So then we have to ask ourselves, if we really want to do anything about these economic flows, obviously this can only be done through some sort of transnational cooperation that goes beyond traditional import and export barriers, which are increasingly meaningless as the words themselves become meaningless. And as more and more commerce becomes digital, if I can actually conduct surgery on you in Canada while I'm in an operating theater in Richmond, Virginia, doing this entirely through telepresence, again, meaningless. The world has the potential of becoming vastly more globalized than it is today, as we actually can conduct commerce digitally in ways that we can barely imagine right now. This is the way we need to adapt our conversation. And of course, the instinct of some politicians in my country, for example, is basically to avoid talking about any of this, try to get people to imagine an economy that no longer exists, and then rally them about nostalgia to recreate it. And that may be successful in the short term, but in the long term, it is deeply irresponsible.
Question over
here. My name is Mohammed. So you mentioned about the new dawn and old enemies. So by the increasing of insecurities, feeling of lack of trust, and also inequality. So how can actually we learn from history, or in another way, history told us those were bleak experience that we face. We have to follow those two major wars just to end up in the new equilibrium. So how can we learn, or how can you convince us with this human history to face our new future on that?
What country are you from?
From Indonesia. Indonesia.
Okay. So during this great struggle, for instance, which in your country was the Dutch East Indies, and then as part of this struggle, your country created a new thing called Indonesia, an entity that had never existed before in history. So then we can ask ourselves, and I've spent a little time in Indonesia, is what brings Indonesians together? What actually creates this country? What, because they were all ruled by Dutchmen? No. Something else has to bring them together. Is it a common language or religion? You know the issues with language very well. It's a challenge. So what has to bring them together is actually something else. And actually, I think the secret of that must lie in liberalism. Indonesia went through painful struggles, including the horrible massacres of the 1960s that you remember, in which other Indonesians killed different people almost again as if they were different tribes. Communist, anti-communist, all of that. So unless Indonesia wants a future of that kind of struggle, your future has to involve some rally around an ideal of what we could call liberalism. And that Indonesia stands for that civic ideal. I am so impressed with the elections you just held in Indonesia and the leadership you now have today and what your leadership is trying to do. That to me is a kind of fairy tale as to how that regime was displaced and how a person like your current president could be in power today. I think that's a fairy tale too. Those are the kinds of ideals on which I think Indonesia can overcome the damaging lessons of history and take something positive around what it is creating right now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Abu Bakr from Nigeria. Well, I think we developing economies like Nigeria, we have more of these transnational issues to deal with than the developed countries, because we're trying to catch up, to learn, to develop democracies, despite the numerous issues of corruption, poverty, and disease. And then now the question is, how do we catch up and meet up with other developed countries so that we'll be on the same page?
Did you say that you were studying development economics?
No, I'm a journalist.
Oh, you're a journalist. Okay. If I could answer your question in the next 60 seconds, I should receive the Nobel Prize right away. But I am struck that I'll come back to this point about liberalism again. Because you see, I think that the corruption in a country like Nigeria actually flows from a lack of liberalism. Frankly, the corruption happens because people gain control of key parts of the economy and they make their deals with the people in government, and that's how it works. And so you have to make that work, you have to close off areas of the economy so that you have to pay the right people to be able to have an economic opportunity. And that's what makes the corruption work. So then, and actually Thomas Jefferson wrote about this in his day with different kinds of monopolies that he was complaining about. What you need to do is to break the power of the monopolies. You have to fear big business as well as big government that is too big. And I'll make a point about this, and this may be a strange and unpopular point. We often use the phrase here, liberal democracy. I will tell you the liberal part is more important than the democracy part. Liberalism came before democracy, and it is above it. Democracy is a means to that end. If a democracy destroys liberalism and brings corruption and dictatorship, the country is not better off. And actually, in the end, democracy will be discredited, and democracy will be the loser. Democracy follows on liberalism as a way to protect liberty, and as a way to protect honesty, and as a way to protect the rule of law. So the concentration that I argue is that the countries that have succeeded are countries that put the issues of openness, up to opportunity, and the rule of law first. If you get those right, frankly, almost everything else can follow. Or I'll put it even more eloquently, I'm fond of an author named Kurt Vonnegut, who was very influential when I was young, not read so much nowadays, but wrote magnificent surrealistic bitter novels called Slaughterhouse-Five and other things from his experiences in World War II about the insanity of the 20th century. So Vonnegut was asked to, Vonnegut went to an assembly with high school students. And in this assembly, one high school student stood up and said, "I've read your anti-war novels and your novels about our insanity. And it seems to me that the lesson of all your novels can be summarized, Mr. Vonnegut, in only 7 words. Love may fail, but courtesy will prevail." And Vonnegut stopped and thought about that, and as he wrote later, he said, "That young man had it exactly right. I could have saved myself a lot of time writing those." But in a way, what those 7 words summarize is the victory of process over passion. And a key to that process is the ideal of civil discourse and the rule of law that exchanges like this are all about.
I see other hands in the audience, but unfortunately, we're out of time at this point. So if some of you have questions, can perhaps catch up with Professor Zelikow during a break. But for now, please join me in thanking Professor Zelikow for some wonderful comments to open the conference.